Hi everyone! So this week I wanted to talk about dialogue because dialogue is my jam. I just love it and I think it can make even a bad story pretty good. It's really great at adding pace and it's great for character development as well. It's perfect, I love it. So this video is going to be sort of a crash course in writing good dialogue, but it's not going to include everything, of course. I've already written a few blog posts on this topic and I'll link to those in the description, but I'm just going to touch upon some of the things I think are most important when it comes to dialogue. I'm also going to be busting a few myths as well. So let's get into it. I want to define some of the terms that I'm going to use in this video. The first one is attribution tags, and these are the tags that we use to attribute dialogue to a certain character. Generally they come in two different forms: dialogue tags, sometimes called speech tags, and action tags. Dialogue tags are your plain and simple he said, she said, John shouted, Mary whispered. They tell you who is talking and sometimes a little bit about how they said their dialogue. Action tags work in much a similar way, but this time they indicate who is speaking based on an action that they have performed. For instance, we might write, John walked across the room, come with me. Come with me is the line of dialogue. John walked across the room is the action tag. Alright, there are a couple of myths I want to bust when it comes to dialogue. First one is, said is dead. No, it isn't. Said is alive and well and would very much like for you to use it in your novel. Said is one of those invisible words, and when we see it in a book, our eyes generally tend to pass right over it without giving it too much thought. It's non-intrusive, it doesn't really shout to let you know that it's there, it just sits quietly on the page and tells you who is speaking when. Said is not dead, and we really should be using it more than any other sort of dialogue tag. The second myth I want to bust: never use any alternatives to said, and this belongs in the same category as any piece of advice that begins with the word never. While alternatives to said don't tend to fly under the radar quite as well, they do draw our attention a little bit more, this isn't inherently a bad thing. As long as you're not using these alternatives too much with every line of dialogue, you're not going to ruin your story. Now, where this advice generally tends to come from is that old show don't tell rule. The idea is that if you're using these kinds of words to describe your dialogue, you're telling us how it was spoken rather than showing us. When it comes to dialogue, usually we can infer from the context around it how the words are spoken. So let's say you set the scene of two parents and one of them is holding their toddler who has just been on an hour-long tantrum and has finally fallen asleep. If the two parents start talking, we're going to assume that they're going to be whispering to each other so as not to wake the child. We can infer that from the context around it. So you can still tell us that they whispered, but it's not necessarily needed because we can understand that. Number 1, use a mix of attribution tags. If you use too many dialogue tags, your story will start to sound repetitive. If you use too many action tags, it might start running too long. The idea is to use a mix of the two, but also remember that you don't have to put an attribution tag on every line of dialogue. Especially if you've got some distinguished character voices, chances are we're going to understand who is speaking when without any kind of attribution. Number 2, don't overuse names. Here's some homework for you. Go to a coffee shop or the park or a restaurant and just listen to the conversations that are happening around you. I want you to count how many times they use the name of the person that they are speaking to. I'm going to guess it's very little, because we really don't use names all that much in dialogue, especially not the name of the person we are currently talking to. We might when it comes to introductions, but not even always then. So this is one of the things that does crop up in writing a lot. It happens all the time in my first drafts. They're just littered with names, and it is something I have to edit out of a lot of my client work as well. We really don't use names all that often in speech, and we should not be doing it in our writing. Number 3, using dialect. I'm not here to tell you whether or not you should use dialect in your story. I'm just going to raise a couple of questions that you should think about if you are considering doing this. The first question is it necessary to the story or the characters? Let's take Irving Welsh's Trainspotting. If you're not familiar, this book is written with quite a lot of dialect, to the point where it can actually be quite difficult to read for some people. However, if we were to rewrite Trainspotting without that dialect, it would undoubtedly take something away from the story and the characters. So we would say here that it is a necessary thing to include. The second question you should ask yourself is if you can do this tactfully. If you don't or have never spoken with the accent that you're trying to represent, it can be dangerously easy to fall back on stereotypes, and that can alienate a portion of your audience. Let's take an example. If you were writing a French character and you wanted to present their accent in dialogue, you might swap the TH for a Z. This phonetic spelling does present the accent, but you run the risk of turning what is a character trait into a potentially offensive stereotype. And there are plenty of other ways that you could show somebody's accent or dialect without imitating it in speech. Number 4, what isn't being said? Dialogue is great for showing us what is being said during an argument, but it's equally important to remember what's being left unsaid. One of the things I remember from my creative writing course is how we as people very rarely get to the heart of the issue right away, especially if you're British. But what I mean by this is that an argument between a couple about one of them leaving the milk out all the time or not putting the top back on the toothpaste actually has nothing to do with milk or toothpaste at all. These are warm up conflicts, they're the jumping off point. How many times have you gotten mad at somebody about a really mundane act and then had the conversation descend into deep underlying frustration about bigger issues? This is quite often how conflicts develop, and it's worth bearing in mind when you're writing dialogue. Jumping to the heart of the issue isn't always believable, and sometimes you need those really mundane arguments because they're not mundane at all. Alright, folks, that's all I've got for you. I have written about dialogue a couple of times, so I'm going to drop a link to those blog posts in the description box. If you thought this was useful, or if you have some of your own tips for writing dialogue, then put those in the comments below. And until the next video, happy writing!